Hey guys, welcome back to the Make Me Whole podcast. I'm your host, Josette Rosado. Today I am joined by the Ana Lopez, sexologist and sex coach, and we are so excited that you are here. Thank you so much for being here, Ana.
Yeah, of
Girl,
course.
I've been dying to have you on this show. We have been talking for so long about having you here, and so we have kind of run into each other by accident, but also Latinas on purpose, right? Uh, Tell us a little bit about you and what you do and why you find it so important to have conversations about sex in our culture.
Yeah. So, again, my name is Ana Lopez. I'm a sexologist and sex coach. So, for those of you that don't know, a sexologist is just, it's like a biologist, right? It's like what I study. So, I actually study sex. I'm currently completing a doctoral degree in sexology. So, I do research in sex, and my research is actually based in the Latina demographic. So, I'm really curious about what we think as Latinas. So, for those of you that are not super into research, there is research out there about like the cultural messages that we receive around sex and sexuality from our parents, from the church, from our culture in general, like all of those things. There's research on what our parents think about the messages and how they talked about sex growing up. There's also research about like teen pregnancy and STIs and all these things. And there's a lot of research about machismo and marianismo and all of these things. But no one is talking about what are the individuals thinking, like the people being affected by this. No one is asking us what we think. So I'm here
Right.
to change that. So that is what I'm doing with my dissertation. So maybe I'll be speaking to some of y'all sooner or later as I start conducting my interviews. And then I'm a sex coach. So I own Sex and Spanglish, which is the name of my business. And I work with predominantly Latina women about we're learning and to deconstruct the cultural messages that we've received growing up as Latinas. And I talk a lot about what I call dual socialization. So essentially, a lot of my clients are individuals of Latin descent, but they were also raised in the US. So they were taught to be American women, right? But then they're also at home, they're being taught a completely different message. And there is
Right.
some overlap, but there is a lot of difference. And so we talk a lot about that. So we're deconstructing that and really figuring out like, what is it that you believe? Like, forget the culture, forget your parents, like, not that that's not important, right? But like, what do you think as an individual? And then I think the most fun part is teaching them how to have mind blowing sex on demand.
I love that. I mean, what are the messages? What is the message? What
How
are
much time you got?
people
No.
hearing?
Yeah, totally. So there's a lot of, so I will just say like the main ones. So there is a lot. So the Latino culture, as you know, it's very rooted in like Catholicism and religion, and that is all fine and dandy. Like, believe in what you want to believe in, but it's also very sex negative. And so it's like, wait until marriage to have sex, which if that's what you want to do, that is fine and dandy. However, what oftentimes happens is we don't wait until marriage to have sex, and
Right.
then we're sitting there shaming ourselves about it. I have a lot of clients that still believe like, I don't think you should have sex before marriage, even though they're not in that boat anymore, but they're also using that belief against themselves. So that's
Right.
one of them. It is also very common in American culture to leave your house once you're like 18 or like after you graduate from college. And so the dating experiences it for those that leave at 18 or like early 20s is vastly different from Latinos who typically stay at home until, they're married. And even then, sometimes they're still at home, which no shame in that, but it is very different and it very much dictates the way that we view dating. And then if we talk about the differences that, the women and men in the families are how they are treated, it's very different messaging. And so the way that we kind of view dating and expect dating to be, especially when we are dating outside of our culture, it can be a culture shock, even though we've been raised in the United States.
Right.
So those are just some of the things that we receive. There's also, I mean, there's a lot we don't talk about, like our bodies. We don't really learn about our bodies. A lot of the time when we our bodies are discussed, it's very negative, right? Like it's like, oh, you started your period, and not that I mean, we could celebrate it, that's fine. Like some people do, some cultures do, But usually when it is talked about, it's like a very negative thing. Like anything that is connected to our bodies is often the way that it's talked about is either directly talked about or indirectly talked about in a very negative manner. And so then we grow up hearing all of these messages. And the way that I frame this to my clients is that we don't turn 18 or we don't get married and like this light switch flips, right? Like
Right.
we hold on to those messages because they are really like the formative messages in our brain. Like they were given to us during these formative years and they kind of just stay there. And then we don't decipher, like, oh, I actually don't believe that. That was like my mom saying that, or my grandma, or church, or whoever.
Right. I mean, I think that it's amazing how no matter what the generations have evolved into, I mean, we're in 2024, these things continue to happen,
Mm-hmm.
or they have up until this point. I like to think that people closer to my generation are starting to break some of those chains where we are discussing more openly,
Mm-hmm.
what it is to be a sexual human being, or being more open about sexual experiences that our children are having, or being more in tune with their own sexuality and what it is that they're experiencing. But I mean, even now, as I'm proud to say I'm a premenopausal woman, I don't even know what that's about. Why? Because there's no one before me who's talking about, like, hey, guess what? You get to go through another life change,
Mm-hmm.
and feel this way in your body, or, be hypersexual, or be, you know, feeling anything different in yourself, because no one still wants to talk about it who might have experienced it before me. So I wonder if you ever run into those kinds of situations where you're like, oh my gosh, like we're still not talking, guys. We're still not discussing these things. And it's just so necessary.
Yeah, literally not to like not give an answer, but it's literally anything that you can think of. There are people like not talking about it. And yeah, and I think a lot of it comes from, as you were talking, like what's coming up for me is like this question of why. So I was a why child. I'm still a why child. I love asking that question. I want to know why everything. Explain it all to me. And that in combination with this idea of like honoring your elders, I think runs really rampant in the Latino culture, right? So I think it is very beautiful. I have a lot of respect for my elders, and I think we take it a little too far. So what
Absolutely.
happens is it's questioning in the sense of, hey, I'm curious, often gets seen as disrespectful. So we end up not asking questions, right? Even when it's coming from a good intention, right? So an example is like, hey, so I'm a teenager. I'm like, hey, mom, can I go out with my kids? Or can I go out with my kids? Can I go out with my friends? And she's like, no. And you're like, oh, like, why? Right. And not because you're like, well, why the hell can't I go out? But it's like, why? Like, I'm
Right.
curious. Like, it's like 3 p.m. on a Friday or like on a Saturday, right? We're not doing anything. We don't have family over. Like, I'm genuinely curious why. But what comes out of our mouth is like, oh, like, well, why not? Right. Because we want to know why, and we get shut down. And so what happens
Absolutely.
time after time after time of hearing that, we just don't ask questions. So we're like, okay, the person that is like the elder, right? So the teacher, right? Or the church or Tia or whoever is seen as the doctor even is seen as the elder. And so we don't ask questions, so then we don't learn,
Mhm.
because how do you
Right.
learn? You ask questions. So we start experiencing things in our body. Well, I'm not supposed to ask, so I'm just not going to ask, right? And then we bring the
Right.
internet into play, and then we have a bunch of misinformation, and we
Oh,
just,
yes.
maybe we hear about it from our friends, or we just don't even talk about it and we suffer in silence.
Yeah. And I love that you say that, you're someone to ask why, because I think now that's a question that's more acceptable.
Mhm.
I know that I can ask why now myself. I allow my own children to ask why respectively, like not the disrespectful, like, why not? Why the hell not? But more like, well, why? Like, what's that about? Or I'm very curious to know. Um whereas that was never something that was made available. It was kind of like, don't you dare ask why, just accept it as it is. And it's unfortunate because it does create a disconnect between what is something innate in us, our own bodies, what's happening within us, our own interactions with, the opposite sex, the same sex, whatever your preference is. It's definitely something that bears discussion, bears some guidance. And to not have that does create a lot of misinformation as
Hmm.
to who we are and who we could be.
Definitely.
So it's sad that, that's something that we have to kind of deal with.
Yeah.
Um, what do you find is the most common issue that your clients bring to the table?
Hmm. That is a tough question. What is the most common? I would say, so I'm a firm believer that we all know what we want, but I will say
Mhm,
that a lot of my clients believe that they don't know what they want, or yeah, they believe they don't know what they want because they haven't given themselves the space or haven't had the opportunity to actually acknowledge what they want. Right. So I
mm,
had a client that was like, yeah, I have no idea what I want. And I'm like, I don't think that's true. So we began having a conversation, and she comes up with like this very detailed, I know nothing about cars, like zero, like you're lucky I know how to put gas kind of thing. So she was like able to give me this visual. She was talking about a truck she wanted. And she was able
mm,
to fully describe it. Like I can still picture it in my mind until this day. And the reason she was able to do that, she already knew that. She wasn't just making it up on the fly. It was something that she actually wanted. But once she was given the space and the opportunity to actually be like, oh, what is it that I want? She knew
mm,
almost immediately what that was. And to have someone on the other end listening to her and asking even more probing questions and getting her more involved in the conversation, she was able to share everything that was already inside of her brain. Right. And so I think that we just don't have the space and the opportunity to really share that. And I noticed that a lot. Going back to like the kids thing, is I noticed this a lot, like with the kids in my family. Like they're all so drawn to me, and it's not just because I spoil them, but it's because when they're talking to me about their shows and whatever, I'm asking them questions and I'm getting them to
right,
like share more information, not because I'm going to use that information. I could give two shits about Paw Patrol or like whatever it is they're
right.
talking about, but they're so drawn to me because I'm sitting there and having a conversation with them. And I think that most people, especially Latinas, don't have a place where they can just sit there and like share whatever it is that they want. And I see this a lot in
Yeah,
the elders in in like my family and in the community as well, is that it's always referred to as like las tías amargadas, right? I see this all the time in like numerous families, right? But really what they're doing when they get together and they're según complaining is really
yes,
they're just sharing all of the things that they cannot share anywhere else. They have nowhere else to share it. Whereas if they were
right.
given a space to actually sit there and have someone listen to them, then maybe they wouldn't be so amargada. Just saying.
Yeah. Especially if it were to be with their partners, like if they
Right.
had that space to talk
Mm-hmm.
about what it is that they need and
Right.
really sharing what their needs are, I think it does make a big difference as to whether or not they would be amargada, and
Right.
whether or not they would just be like, listen, let me tell you what you need to do so that you can be in a happier space when it comes to being with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I work a lot with couples, and we definitely, they come in with their own agendas and they never know what it is that's wrong with the marriage. And one of the first questions I ask them is, how's your sex life? And for Latinos, that's always like a, oh, did she just ask that question? And I'm like, listen, people, we're about to get into it because I need to know, like, are you spending that time with one another?
Mm-hmm.
And 9 times out of 10, they're like, it's okay. It's all right, And one of my kind of like, I'm really comical with my manners of talking to my clients. And we do get into like different methods of what intimacy looks like and what have you. And oftentimes I'll find that men and women have different cues when it comes to, it's not just about the love languages. Like I love the whole concept of love languages. I can stand behind that. But it is really their communication in their intimacy and their
Mhm.
communication as to their drives when it comes to their sexuality. And I wonder, do you also run into that when you're doing your coaching, like, and how to get people back to reality and back to communicating like what it is I like and what it is I don't like. I'll especially talk to, like, I'll give you an example of like a husband who I'm like, listen, that slap on the ass doesn't tell her like, woohoo, I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
It's like, why are you slapping me on my ass? Like that did nothing for me. So I'm just wondering, like, in your own work, do you find that that's something that you have to redirect when it comes to the communicating intimacy or communicating drive when it comes
Yeah.
to women and their women or men in their relationships?
Yeah, definitely. So I always teach my clients. So a major part of what I do with them is teach them how to have mind blowing sex on demand. And what I teach is that there's only three things that you need in order to have mind blowing sex, which is effective communication, understanding your body, and the ability to rest and rejuvenate. And so a lot of what we hear is like, oh, well, you need a specific like penis size, or you need a specific toy, or whatever, right? And I those things are fine and dandy, but that is not necessary in order to have mind blowing sex. And so it does start with like understanding your body. So, what is it that you like? What is it that you don't like? And also, like the functionalities of your body that aren't necessarily sexual, right? Do during certain parts of my cycle, maybe I'm like more sensitive, right? During certain parts of my cycle. So, I don't want to be touched in certain places, or maybe I don't know, maybe it's painful because it's so sensitive, right? Or um do I know when I'm getting an infection, right? Or like different things
Right.
like that. Do you understand your body as a whole, right? Independent of the sex part. And also, do you know what you like? Do you know what you like don't like in the bedroom? A vast majority of people at least know one thing that they like and like two to three things that they don't like. That I would say that is
Right.
the vast majority of people. And so I love how people come in and try to tell me that they don't know when I'm like, you know, at least one thing. So anyway,
Yeah.
so there's that. And then the people that do know, that finally are like, okay, fine. I know one thing that I like. I know like two to three things that I don't like that I should be trying to avoid, you know, um, they need to learn how to effectively communicate that. And keyword, effective, right? Just being like,
Mhm.
well, you never go down on me is not effective, right?
Right.
You getting mad because your partner keeps having sex with you in the same way when you're not saying anything is not effective communication, right? And there's this
Right.
big misconception about how our partners, whether it's the first time we're having sex with them or the 25th time we're having sex with them or even like the 200th time we're having sex with them, that they should know what we want. And that is not necessarily true. I don't care how long you've been with this person. I don't care how many times you've had sex with this person. It does not matter because bodies change. Your
Right.
what is the word in English? Your gustos, your what you like changes
The
from
things you
time to
like,
time.
yeah.
Yeah. what
Right.
what you like
Year to
changes from time
year,
to time. Right.
absolutely.
Depending on your age, depending on where you are in your cycle, depending on what's going on with your body physically, right? Like things change. So you cannot expect, you can guess, but guessing isn't effective, right? If you go to a
Not at
restaurant
all.
and you just guess what somebody, if the waiter just guesses what you want, then maybe you'll get what you like and maybe you won't. So the same thing applies to the bedroom, right? So do not expect to know what your partner likes, and do not expect your partner to know what you want and what you like and all of those things.
That's
So
right.
going back to the effective communication, it's about really sharing that with your partner from your perspective rather than being like, well, you never do this and I hate that you do this. Share your experience. Like, hey, you know what? I really like this thing and I'm not really a fan of this. And sharing that from your perspective, right? And I love that you
Right.
mentioned redirection. I know it wasn't in the same context, but it reminded me that, like, I teach my clients to redirect in the moment. It is super common, especially for those of us that are having issues with sex, to be like, you're doing it again, you're doing it too fast, or you're doing it wrong, or whatever, and killing the moment, and then no one
Right.
has fun. But you can redirect. So if your partner is doing something that you don't like, let's imagine they're playing with your nipples and you're like, oh, I'm really sensitive today. Like, I'm not feeling that at all. Be like, hey, I actually really love when you play with my nipples. And today I would actually love it even more if you did it over here, and tell them where, explain to them,
Right.
right? And stop getting pissed off. I know this is easier said than done, but stop getting pissed off that you have to tell your partner what to do. That's just a given. You need
I
to tell
think
your
that's
partner what to do.
key.
In order
Hmm.
to get what you want, you need to tell your partner, right? You need to be able to have that communication with them. And
Yeah.
at first, it's going to be verbally. Eventually, you're going to get in the habit of being able to tell them in a way that isn't necessarily like you're sitting there explaining to them, numerically how to do it, right? Giving them step by step directions. But you have to start somewhere. And if you spent years or multiple sex sessions with a person, getting them into the habit, because we are creatures of habit, doing specific things that you don't like, it's going to take some unlearning and it's going to take some time.
Yeah. I mean, I also encourage people in that same respect to get their elders out of the bedroom. Like, there's nobody looking at you.
Right.
There is nobody stepping in there, standing over the bed going, no, 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 de eso no se
Right.
habla. You do not talk about that. You
Yeah.
don't do that to your husband. Don't do that to your wife. Nobody's in there but the two of you. And if
Mm-hmm.
you have been so close to see children being born, seeing each other naked, seeing each other sick, seeing each other unwell, whatever it is, you can be in that moment and communicate with each other effectively enough to know that what you're speaking of is trustworthy, and you can get that message sent, understood, and see some effective change. But oftentimes it's like, I can't say that. I
Mm-hmm.
know I can't say that. And it's like, who is the judge and jury that's around you? Where's
Mm-hmm.
the tia? I don't see
Yeah.
them in the room with you.
Yeah, I always call it like the mom voice. Like, I have a lot of
Mm.
clients that say like, "Okay, I'm married now, so like I can have sex, right? It's approved, right? Like I can have sex, but I feel like I'm going to get in trouble." Like their mom is like going to barge in. Mom doesn't even live there, or she's not even living anymore, right? And they're like, "Oh, well, I feel like she's like going to barge in and like I'm going to get in trouble." And that goes back to
Right,
what I was saying earlier about how like we don't realize the messages that we receive growing up, like how they still impact us today. And that's a lot of what I do, the work that I do with my clients, of like these things that seemingly aren't related to sex are related to sex, because that voice
right.
is playing in the background of your head, even if you don't believe it logically. Like some of my clients are like, I don't give two shits if people wait till marriage to have sex, right? But in the back of their mind, they're like, oh, well, you're not married. You shouldn't be having sex, right? Even though they
Mm-hmm.
logically don't believe that, it's like these two beliefs that are like battling against one another. It's because
Absolutely.
they haven't recognized, like, oh, that's my mom's voice in the back of my head. It's not mine.
Yeah. I hear that so profoundly, and I think that it is a battle that they go through, and I look forward to the days where people don't have to go through that, where they could just be comfortable in their own skin and know that that chain can be broken. That
Mm-hmm.
chain can be broken. It's not something that we have to live with. Yeah. What do you think is the most effective way for people to begin kind of shedding that light and coming into their own comfort levels when it comes to their sexuality? How do they
Yeah.
start?
Yeah, so I think it's about deciphering like the this sounds really weird. Like deciphering the voices in their head, right? So the voice, the mom voice, like I call it, that you hear, it's in your voice. And so that's why it's so weird when it shows up. You're like, I don't really believe that, but it's in my
Right.
head, so I must believe it, right? But that's not true. And so I would encourage people to start by noticing like all the voices that are in their head, and like, is this my own thought, or like where did I get this from? Right? Like, did I get this from my mom? Did I get this from my tia or my grandma? Did I get it from church? Did I get it from somebody at school? Like, where did it come from? Did it come from your own brain? And like, that's fine. But like deciphering what is yours and what's not. Like, I imagine
Mhm.
it being like going through your house and looking at all the things and being like, oh, is this supposed to be here? Or is this like my sister's sweater that she left over here, right? Or like my nephew's shoes that he left over here, and really like cleaning house and figuring out what goes in here and what doesn't, and
Right.
everything that isn't your own like messaging, right? Like any of the thoughts that you don't want to keep, that didn't come from you, that you don't believe, that don't serve you, you could just get rid of them. They're
Yeah.
just not yours. And really just making that, it sounds like super simple, but really just making that acknowledgement of like, oh yeah, these aren't even mine. That doesn't mean that they won't show up every once in a while, right? Like your sister's going to come over again. She's going to leave her sweater again because she does it all the time. But just reminding yourself, like, oh yeah, this isn't my sweater. Like, okay.
Okay. And what about when they start expressing themselves and start having those conversations with the tias, with the sisters, with the mothers, and saying, like, hey, guess what? Here's my new profound sense on my sexuality and life. How can they encourage themselves when they may be around other women or other persons who are just not there? What would be your advice?
Yeah, I would say allowing themselves to get really comfortable first and deciding ahead of time, like if that's even something that they want to share. If they are hearing,
Exactly.
I think there's a difference between being open to sharing what it is that you're learning and what is it like the changes that you're making on all of those things. Like that's one. Like you can decide whether or not you want to do that.
Right.
And then there's something to say about, you know, continuing to listen to these sex negative messages and like, what do you want to do about that, if anything, right? Is it you hear mom talking about, you know, I don't know, this person's a hoe or like whatever, I don't know, whatever they're saying. Is it that you want to say something? Is it that you want to walk away? Is it you just want to put on headphones and start listening to a podcast or, you know,
Right.
call a friend or whatever, right? Like, is it that? Is it like that you need to set boundaries with yourself when you're around people having these sex negative conversations? Or is it that you actually want to share, you know, with your mom, with your sister, whoever? And if so, like getting really clear on what those reasons are.
Yeah, and not everybody, especially when we're dealing with long-term generational kinds of behaviors and thought patterns, not everybody's ready to change. So we
Hmm.
just really need to recognize that we may be on this really great healing journey, but not everybody is there. So
Hmm.
we just got to stick with it. Stick with it on our own, get comfortable, like you said, and kind of just understand that we need to stick to our own space and let people stay in theirs.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think there's something to say about like let's take it out of the sex context for a second. Like let's imagine that you have debt and you like want to pay off debt and you want to become debt free and start investing or something like that. If you are around a bunch of your friends, like you hang out with your friends all the time, they're wanting to go out, they're wanting to buy drinks, they want to go out to brunch, like go on these trips, all of these things. Like not to say that you can't be friends with them anymore, but you have to take a look at who you're surrounding yourself with. If
Right.
you are continually being surrounded by sex negative messages and you are trying to get out of that, it is going to be difficult to get yourself out of that, right? If you're consistently hearing, oh, you know, you shouldn't be doing this and you shouldn't be doing that, or women shouldn't be doing this, Latinas, you shouldn't be doing that, like whatever. If you're continually like swimming in the soup, after you're trying to do your own work on your own, that's something like to think about, right? Like, and it's
Right.
okay that your friends and family aren't there yet, but really trying to find a space where it is sex positive in some capacity, whatever that looks like for you. So that's like one of the main
Absolutely.
reasons why I created a group coaching program in the first place. I was like, I don't know, like what you know about like the coaching world, but it is very like common, it's very common for people to, or like a popular opinion that like you start with one-on-one coaching and then go to group. Like that's, I don't know what people recommend. And I'm like, F that, like I want group coaching. And I was so adamant because I was like, one, we are very, as Latinas, we are very like familial centered. Like we do things in groups. Like this is just what it is. So it felt
Right.
very familiar to me. And also I was like, no, we need a group where they can see other people are doing this that look like me, that it is okay. I have a space to go. Like, I can go and talk about this, and I can celebrate that I'm having amazing sex, because I'm not going to go and tell my mom and be like, hey, guess what? Like, I really wanted to have that space. So yeah, that's exactly why I created a group coaching program.
And it's so needed. It is so needed. So I think that it's great that you have that. And you're right. We like to do things together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important. That's important for you to have that space for those women to just be able to be themselves and celebrate their accomplishments. So good for you. That's incredible. All right, well, where can people find you?
Yeah. So I am on, I always say all the socials. I don't know that it's all the socials, but majorly at Sex and Spanglish. So if you just look up Sex and Spanglish, Spanglish, not Spanish, you will find me. I also have a podcast that is called Sex and Spanglish. It's currently on hiatus, but there's like 60 something episodes. So go and binge that. And then in any of the links in my bios, I have my link tree where you can come and work with me. I have, like I mentioned, I have the group coaching program, La Sinvergüenza Symposium, which is Latinas only group coaching program, where we work on, diving into all those cultural experiences that we have as Latinas and really learning how to have mind-blowing sex on demand. I also do one-on-one coaching. So yeah, more than happy to help y'all have mind-blowing sex.
And I will make sure that all the links are in the description for the podcast. Anna, thank you so much for finally getting on my podcast and just sharing your knowledge. And I hope to have you here again. Just the work you do is amazing. And I just hope that you keep doing what you're doing, girl.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, guys, thank you for another great episode. And I will see you on the next one.